Robert Bork came under sharp attack today by black political leaders. They testified that if Bork had been on the U.S. Supreme Court, Martin Luther King Jr. would have stayed in jail and the civil rights movement would never have gotten off the ground. NBC News law correspondent Carl Stern has more on today's heated hearing.
I have no question about his judicial.
Do you have any question about his integrity?
I have none, but I would ask you.
Well, that's what this.
No, I'd ask you to read. No.
The start of testimony of witnesses showed the deep divisions over the Bork nomination. Senator Strom Thurmond clashed angrily with another prominent Republican, former Transportation Secretary William Coleman.
I would just urge you to read the rest of the paragraph.
Coleman brought with him a 52-page brief contending that Bork has been wrong on just about every important civil rights and civil liberties case in the last 40 years.
So here you have, Judge, that in every instance on these great issues, publicly, as a scholar, always comes out the wrong way.
Former Congresswoman Barbara Jordan also testified against the nomination. A member of the House committee that voted to impeach Richard Nixon during Watergate, she strongly attacked Bork's firing of Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox.
For you to confirm Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, I think, sends the wrong message. I believe that such a confirmation would indicate that it's all right with you for a person to sit on the Supreme Court who has utter disdain for the office of special prosecutor. I don't think that is the message you want to send.
After watching Bork's testimony last week, the first Republican announced publicly he would vote against Bork, Senator Robert Packwood.
And so, given my conclusion that we ought to preserve those rights we now have and pass them on to our children a bit more secure than we got them from our parents, I have no choice but to oppose the nomination of Judge Bork for the Supreme Court.
Late this afternoon, Bork's supporters released a list of 53 prominent Americans who wish to testify in favor of the nomination, including retired Chief Justice Warren Burger. Carl Stern, NBC News at the U.S. Capitol.
The Reagan administration took a firm states' rights position on the AIDS issue today. The administration opposed federal action to bar discrimination against AIDS victims, even if some state approaches are not working. More on this story from NBC's Bob Kerr.
Today's testimony by Health and Human Services Secretary Otis Bowen puts the Reagan administration on a collision course with Congress over how to combat AIDS. Legislation introduced by Senator Edward Kennedy and Congressman Henry Waxman would make it illegal to disclose names and other information obtained through AIDS counseling and testing, ban discrimination against people infected with AIDS, and spend $400 million a year on health clinics that serve high-risk populations. In contrast, the Reagan administration would spend less than $100 million a year and leave disclosure and discrimination laws up to the states for now.
Strengthening of confidentiality protection may be necessary, but we believe more examination is called for before federal legislation is considered.
But Congressman Waxman says if the Reagan administration is serious about fighting AIDS, it must support federal legislation preventing discrimination and disclosure.
Health and medical professionals must be able to say that people volunteering for testing will not find their names in the news and will not lose their jobs and homes.
Indiana Congressman Frank McCloskey brought a letter from a woman whose 83-year-old mother has been turned away from several nursing homes because she was infected with AIDS during a blood transfusion 5 years ago. Yet California Republican William Dannemeyer insists the rights of others are involved.
To say that those with the virus for AIDS should be the benefit or have the benefit of anti-discrimination language may very well put at risk people in our society who don't want to get the disease, who don't have it now.
Many in Congress insist AIDS is a national epidemic that requires a national policy. They say leaving it up to states is too random when a coordinated effort is needed. Bob Kerr, NBC News at the U.S. Capitol.
Jessica Hahn was questioned by a federal grand jury today. She's the woman whose sexual encounter with TV evangelist Jim Bakker led to his downfall. This jury in Charlotte, North Carolina is investigating the PTL ministry's finances and especially the sources of money paid to her. NBC's Kenley Jones reports from Charlotte.
Jessica Hahn said she was nervous about her grand jury appearance.
It's the longest walk I ever took.
She told her lawyer it reminded her of how nervous she was when she went to Florida to meet Jim Baker in 1980 and had sex with him. The grand jury wants to know the details of a $265,000 hush money payment promised to her if she would keep quiet about the sex. She got about $20,000 before the story became public. The payment was negotiated by California businessman Paul Roper, who was at the courthouse today.
There's just nothing I can tell you.
Hahn told NBC News that Baker was also directly involved in arranging the payment.
I was told that Jim Baker was selling a house, and I'd received the money from Jim Baker.
Who told you that?
Jim Baker and Paul Roper.
Did you ever speak to Jim Baker personally about the payments?
No, I'm sorry, we can't answer that question.
We're getting a little detailed.
No, next question.
The grand jury is investigating whether Baker used any PTL money for the payoff rather than personal funds, possibly through inflated construction costs of buildings at Heritage USA, the PTL theme park. If so, that could lead to indictments for misappropriation of funds, falsifying records, and tax evasion. While Jessica Hahn is said to be cooperating fully with the grand jury, she was reluctant to answer many questions by reporters today. She said she has sold her story for an undisclosed sum to Playboy magazine, which will publish it next week, along with pictures of her posing topless.
You'll understand it when you read it, believe me.
Kinley Jones, NBC News, Charlotte, North Carolina.
And a small embarrassment for Vice President George Bush. It seems that his mother-in-law, his wife's stepmother, wrote a letter to presidential candidate Congressman Jack Kemp saying, "If I were not George Bush's mother-in-law, I would certainly be working for you." And she sent Kemp a $5 check.